What are you most excited for fans to see in upcoming issues of Amazing Spider-Man? Well,
we've got our new volume of Amazing Spider-Man. That's with Zeb Wells, John Romita Jr., Scott Hanna, and Marcio Menes.
It's an honor and a privilege, and doing it with John Romita Jr. and then Ed McGuinness and Pat Gleason. It's weird to know that you're at the pinnacle of what you'll do in the industry, because it won't get better than this.
And so we are trying to bring in this year with the greatest spider content the world has ever seen. I tried to put together the best Spider-Man book ever to be published. That is my goal.
Amazing Spider-Man comes out frequently, like extra frequently, and they're often supersized.
Yes.
Are you okay?
No.
Woof woof. Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Zeb Wells and illustrated primarily by John Romita Jr., Patrick Gleason, and Ed McGuinness. The first issue in this volume of The Amazing Spider-Man was published by Marvel Comics in April of 2022, with the 60th and final being released in October 2024. And Peter Parker's life has gone to hell after a mysterious incident 6 months prior. He's in debt, falling out with his friends, family, and fellow heroes. And worst of all, MJ started a family with a new guy. How did this all happen? Can Spider-Man turn things back around? And what if the entity that caused all this mess in the first place returns? I feel like I heard everything there is to hear about this run before I read the first issue. It's the worst Spider-Man run of all time. Just when you think it's hit its lowest point, it keeps sinking lower. Wells is ruining Peter Parker. Paul is the worst. Paul should never have been created. Paul is everything wrong with modern Marvel. Paul. So, to say I had low expectations would be an understatement. Could it really be that bad? We open on a battle-worn Peter, distraught in a crate outside of Pennsylvania. Then it's 6 months later. Things are awkward with Aunt May. A debt collector permanently waits for Peter outside of his apartment. Robbie is pissed at him. Johnny Storm visits just to say that the Fantastic Four are still annoyed with him, which surely one of his neighbours must have seen this. And Peter is hesitant to call MJ. And when he does, he's told to never call again. Wait, is this really issue 1 or have I missed something? Honestly, for as much whiplash as it gave me, I don't hate the we're skipping ahead of time and not telling you what went wrong trope. Sure, it is a bit cliche and it immediately sets an alarm bell off that the payoff won't be worthy. But for me, this is far better than spending the entire debut issue coming up with forced nonsensical devices so that the status quo can be retconned to the point where the story needs it to be. Yep, I'm gonna give Wells an early edge over Spencer, because he didn't make some dumb proofreading machine that robbed Peter of his livelihood. But it does feel like this cataclysmic level threat that we haven't seen yet was solely made to break up Peter and MJ. Like in the same day, 3 people remind Peter that he fucked up, and this is supposed to be 6 months later, yet all of those people forgave him really quickly after this. So does it really need to be laid on so thick when the only thing that is actually different is MJ icing him out? Well, that's not the only thing, because of course, there's Paul. If you've heard of this run, then you've probably heard of Paul. And I don't know if it was Wells' intention, but there's just something so off-putting about him from the first time that we see him. He's the guy MJ's with now, and they live together with 2 kids that we're led to assume are his. I can understand the immediate resentment towards him, because the relationship between Peter and MJ was one of the main highlights of Spencer's run. So from the start, there was already such a high barrier for Paul to overcome, just to justify his very existence. And in these early issues, he's kinda just there. And it might sound odd that I'm already comparing this with Spencer's run, but it's because I had that so fresh in my mind. And because the only comments I seemed to get on that video was, you should be grateful that at least it's not Wells. And a little secret for you, a later run being worse doesn't make the earlier bad one any more enjoyable. But one area where these early issues couldn't compare with Spencer is the art. Dear God, how on earth am I genuinely gonna weigh up Ryan Otley with modern day John Romita Jr.? Just look at this cover, what on earth is going on with that leg? And that rear arm, I think I snapped my rotator cuff just looking at it. And that's all before wondering if he's supposed to be running across buildings or swinging, because somehow it doesn't look right for either. But bizarrely, the interior pages are more like the Romita Jr. from Kick-Ass rather than the Romita Jr. from Well, the covers of this series. The action's framed well and has a nice pace. The establishing shots and backgrounds are mostly all there, and somewhat capture the feeling of a New York setting, and in the emotional moments, the scenes are allowed to convey the feelings intended. Don't worry, I'm not turning heel and completely glazing Romita Jr. because I still had my guard up and I could see some early warning signs. Like, there was a scene between Black Cat and MJ where all the characters had the exact same face. The longer this run goes on, the more problems like that crop up, but I'm getting ahead of myself, so respect where it's due, and I was pleasantly surprised that Romita Jr. is better on the interiors than he is on the covers. Yet what took me most by surprise was Tombstone being the opening villain. I knew he was going to play a big role later on, but having him here from the start did a good enough job of making me put those questions that I had from the Pennsylvania scene on pause, and signified that this wanted to be a ground level story. Don't get me wrong, I think every Marvel crime boss is just living in the shadow of the Kingpin, but sometimes you have to take what you can get, and it's because he's not at the top of that hierarchy that he can feel more threatening. He can just drive right up to Peter, so that he can tell Spider-Man that the upcoming war is all his fault. And I have to admit, I was intrigued to see where this could go. From his first scene, it's clear there's already so much tension between the different gangs in New York, all fighting for greater control, and Tombstone obviously wants it all, but the others are doing anything they can to take him out. But he does get him a good boost for saving his cat when his apartment's targeted. But now's probably the best time to admit that I've never really cared about Randy Robertson. I get that he and Peter are close friends and live together, but no writer's ever found a way to make him interesting. I prefer plots that revolve around Aunt May, but at least if Wells is going with Tombstone, it has an easy way to not make Randy's inclusion so forced. If anything, he adds to that layer somewhat, as he's been dating Tombstone's daughter Janice for some time now, and wants to propose. That is nice, sure, but in these early issues, I couldn't help but feel that there wasn't enough here to carry an opening story arc, let alone get me hyped for the whole run. There are things brought in like this debt collector, Digger, Rabbit, Paul, but until Tombstone does something, they're just a bunch of elements sitting around to remind us that they're probably going to become important later on. And for as nice of a boring guy as Randy is, he is nowhere near engaging enough to be the emotional linchpin of the whole thing. Tombstone's cat has a better chance with that, so I did just want more, and I didn't even get that after the setup was done. I can't even put my finger on why it didn't have that oomph, because we got a fun fight between Spidey and Tombstone, but I wasn't engaged whilst reading it. The whole thing felt like it was going through the motions. Could it be that the art and the flat look just didn't bring that excitement? Was it that I'd grown so used to bigger threats that Tombstone doesn't bring the suspense that I wanted it to? Or was it that there was no emotion connected behind it? Great Spider-Man stories always have Peter fighting for the very thing that being Spider-Man takes him away from, whether that's a job, relationship, or even to fulfill his sense of responsibility. Yet despite the brewing gang war, it felt like they were solely fighting because the issue needed a fight. And we also needed Tombstone to capture Spidey so that the story could continue. He'd solidified his presence early on, but we really needed an entire issue of him beating the snot out of Spider-Man and yet never peeking under the mask. And the entire time I kept thinking, why couldn't Peter break out of the restraints? All we get is Tombstone saying that the chains won't give, but why? The guy is already ripped through the roof of an armored van in this very same series, so a little explanation would help. It was clearly to suit the plot, which was already something that was happening a lot, even to the point where Peter will act completely out of character just to keep things moving, because once he's released by a guy called Kareem, who's a character that's gonna have more than a few appearances in this series, Peter goes on the absolute warpath and doesn't stop to think, recover, calm down, or even get his bearings. Yeah, it's a fun issue, but something about it doesn't feel like a Spider-Man issue. Sure, he's up against the clock to catch up with Tombstone before he can hurt Randy's dad, and there have been stories before where he's reckless, but this feels better suited to when we were reading the Superior Spider-Man. The only thing that doesn't give me that vibe is the voice. Now, I don't think Wells knows who he wants his Spider-Man to be, but he knows how to convey his mannerisms. It wasn't ridiculous levels of exposition like with the Spencer run, and whether it be narration or dialogue, Peter is witty with all of his quips that you'd come to expect, and can bring that sense of pressure and dread when the water is boiling, just like it is when he's running through this building. It's why I didn't ask any questions until it was over, because all of this is done to not reveal the big twist, that Peter just took out all of the Rose's men for Tombstone, as he was in a completely different building the entire time. Because of the ticking time bomb, I got caught up in the rush as I was reading it. It did catch me off guard, and I didn't think twice when Peter truly believed that Tombstone must have had one of his goons dress up as the Rose, which should make absolutely no sense to him unless he already knew it was a trick, and that's what it all boils down to. Every contrivance was just so that we could get to where Wells needed us, but not because it's what made sense for the characters, and it didn't bother me as much whilst I was reading it. but it's something I noticed the longer the run went on. There was a fun follow-up issue where Spideyworks would dig it to get revenge on Tombstone, but if it wasn't the big T, the mob boss characters weren't that interesting. There was nothing engaging about them beyond whether they were with or against Tombstone, and it was pretty easy to forget what their allegiance was. Speaking of things that were quick to forget, we have another scene with Aunt May like we did in the first issue, and she's completely forgotten about how upset she was with him just a few days earlier, about whatever it was that she was upset with him for. Did he really take that hard of a beating that even Aunt May can't recall things? Unfortunately though, it seems like even the series itself forgot about that cold open. What about building tension, giving us a few clues, or bare minimum, just signpost that whatever the cold open was, hasn't been snapped out of existence, especially since the next few issues really don't have any fluidity or cohesion. I've got 3 major pet peeves with modern comics, and somehow one issue with this series combined 2 of them: baffling issue numbering and unnecessary oversized specials. You don't need to double or triple the page count just because the issue number on the front ends in a 0 or a 5, especially if the story doesn't warrant it. And spoiler alert, this one doesn't. At a lackluster surprise party for Peter's birthday, J. Jonah Jameson crashes in, having been taken prisoner by Doc Ock's tentacles to lure them into where Otto's being held captive. This was something teased from the first issue, but now we learn it's some conduit of the living brain. And I'm fully okay with being labelled a casual if it means I can admit that I did not care in the slightest about this reveal. I sort of remember the character from Superior, which is why I thought it made sense that they would be behind Otto's kidnapping, but was I supposed to be losing my mind that they brought the living brain into the story? I genuinely don't know what reaction it wanted. The thing is, this issue wouldn't have needed double the pages if it didn't spend so many of them dragging out scenes that could have been done in a few panels. Did we really need 5 pages of explanation about how the brain got to where they are? Even the exciting moments like the chase with the tentacles and the fights felt dragged out. Whereas the one thing that might have helped this issue is if we got more time at the party where Peter finally has a chance to be himself. Flash Thompson's back, and if I remember right, this is the first time they've seen each other since he came back from the dead, but we just get one panel of banter and not a single question about his whole ordeal or what he might have missed. To give it credit, the humour has been on point so far, and this party gave more of a glimpse into that, at least until it was rushed away for the next scene. One thing that has been creeping in is Black Cat, and I like how she's used early on. She's sort of just like a concerned friend, trying to make sure that he doesn't fall flat on his face. And especially in this dynamic where everyone seems to hate Peter, it's nice to have one person on his side. But that's when I realised I don't even know what's going on in this issue. I thought Peter was public enemy number 1 and that he'd done something so unforgivable 6 months ago that no one wanted to be in the same room as him. So where are all these people when he was being shit on daily? Because it doesn't say it's in the present, or was it just supposed to know when Peter's birthday is? There are a good few characters at this party who haven't had any interaction with Peter so far in this series. So how am I supposed to know how they feel about whatever happened in Pennsylvania? None of the dots were connecting for me. Like, there was a Sinister Six Adaptoid which had taken the powers of the Sinister Six members that were all kidnapped by the living brain. And this fight was fun, I can't deny it, even if it didn't make any sense. Ed McGuinness has a knack for big bombastic action, even if the colouring meant that his line work didn't pop in its usual way. But with the Six teaming up with Spidey to help him defeat the Adaptoid and then turning against him after, and the timeline not being clear, I kept wondering, why wasn't this an annual? The stuff with Tombstone wasn't exactly blowing me away, but I didn't need this sudden of an exit out of it. In the space of one issue, we've gone from a Peter who was so filled with rage that he brutally took out an entire crime syndicate and became complicit in a gang war, to him having his birthday party ruined by a sentient pair of Doc Ock tentacles. What tone is this going for? Like, it's possible to have both, you'd just have to be way better at it. At least if this had been an annual, it would rid me of my second pet peeve, baffling issue numbering. Now, if you're new to this channel, you've probably already realised that I like to waffle and I have the nitpickiest of nitpicks, so get ready for this one. The reason this wasn't regular sized is because it's celebrating 900 issues of Spider-Man, except it's not. This series made a conscious choice just 5 issues before it to reset the numbering back to 1. If it wanted to celebrate 900 issues that badly, it should have just kept the legacy numbers. Was it to signify that Wells had started on the book? Was that really necessary when a big anniversary was so close? Could Wells have not just picked up the numbering from whoever was writing before this volume? Wait, who was that actually? It would have been issue 894. Wait, that was also Wells. If you think I've blown this out of proportion, fair play to you. I can't even argue against that, but I'm highlighting these problems now. The first time they show up so you can see how often they happen, and one of the biggest problems is highlighted by the living brain himself. with the question that he keeps asking from this issue onwards. Who is Spider-Man? Simple enough at first, and it makes sense for a brain that's looking to be the greatest intelligence to want to know the answer, but something kept me wondering if it wasn't just a question within the story that needed answering, but one that Wells himself didn't know the answer to, and that's both as a character and for the series as a whole. Case in point, the whole thing with Norman. In an earlier issue, he approached Peter, but now he wants to offer him a job. And there's this constant push-pull dynamic to the point where I think Peter would have been better off if he just declined the call. But it was the plot that needed him there, and for two reasons. The first is so that we could have another awkward moment between Peter and MJ. She says she's there because she's an ambassador for a product that she wanted Norman to check if it's safe. Which, I don't care how many sins he was cleansed of, I ain't trusting him with that. And also, couldn't she have just sent in the sample? Paul is also there because, of course, delivering a bottle of pills is a two-person job. And why wouldn't you want some random dude walking around your lap? But there's another hint to what went on in the 6-month skip, and then I realised, I don't care what happened anymore. The outcome was there from the beginning. Peter and MJ split up, and that's that. Everyone else is fine with Peter again, so why waste time with all these awkward scenes with Paul where no one says what happened? The second is because Norman's coming in as a big part of this run. He's still the sins-cleansed version of himself from Spencer's run who just wants to tell Peter where he can. And the two had been working on a project together that results in him designing a Goblin Spider hybrid design, which honestly, I didn't think was enough of a change to really stand out. The yellowy green didn't go well with the red and blue, and I don't get what the point in the screen mask was that could one time show Microsoft Paint level emojis. If I'm honest, functionally, it's just the Iron Spider suit but nowhere near as iconic. Yet it's not the worst design we'll see in this run. It does come in clutch when the Vulture attacks Peter and destroys his original suit. Norman sends his design out and it comes with its own spider glider, which Peter's immediately okay with and seems to prefer over his web shooters. That he clearly has again by the time he's captured Vultures, so don't tell me that they were broken. Despite calling for the suit and using it, the whole ordeal has Peter going back to Oscorp enraged. But one thing leads to another and Peter accepts the job originally offered. And finally, it felt like there was something different going on. I don't hate this idea. I can't speak yet for how it pans out over the whole series, but there's more at stake than wondering if Randy gets Tombstone's approval. There is the ambiguity around if Norman's changed. You can't fully trust him even when he is doing everything right. And it's such an uneasy alliance that I'm interested to see how it unfolds. We catch up with Peter at the Hellfire Gala. He's got the black and red suit on, Wolverine is busting his balls just like he does to everyone in the other X-Men books, and MJ's there. Then he's having his statement psychically taken, because Moira McTaggart is continuing her attack against Krakoa, and wait, have I loaded up an issue of X-Men by mistake? Unfortunately, no we didn't, and thus the run has completed my trifecta of comic book pet peeves. Confusing, pointless tie-ins. I get that this likely wasn't Wells' choice. I don't think he was running up to editorial begging for just one issue to connect to the Hellfire Gala. But he could have at least helped me out by telling me what was going on. Honestly, was he expecting me to have been reading every single issue from the Krakoa saga alongside this? Like, I want to do it eventually, but I didn't think it would be a requirement for a Spider-Man book. To be honest, after the initial setup, it is just a story about Spidey and Wolverine saving MJ, and it was quite fun. I did feel like Peter was acting like an angsty teen again, and except for the narration, Wells writes Peter like the memed moments from Web of Shadows.
Where's Cage and his search party? Pretty redhead, arm and aghast. You are no help, MJ!
But it's any time he speaks to anyone. Yet in this scenario, it's understandable, and it did find a way to connect it back to the friction between Peter and MJ, even if they were back to the same point that they were at in issue 1. I thought they were planning a dinner together last time we saw them, so what's changed? It's Paul. Paul's what's changed. Because again, we're not told what happened that broke them up, just that it's Paul's fault. And I can't help but wonder if Wells wanted him to be so hated. But for as out of place as that crossover was, at least it's a one-off, and it's not like there's back-to-back unnecessary event tie-ins. Ah crap. AXE Judgment Day was a 6-issue event from 2022 by Kieran Gillen, and it's funny when you read a series after it's done because you get to look back on the events at that time, but with the hindsight of its reputation. And I don't hear anyone saying anything about Axe. Am I even saying it right? I know it's an anagram, but still. And why is Spider-Man dragged into it? He's not on any of the event's covers, and I don't think he's an Avenger at this point, nor is his name in the anagram, else that'd make it Sax, or axes, and we already had one of those. From what I know, Judgment Day takes place after a Celestial is awoken, and all of humanity is put under judgment to see if they're worthy to exist, which comes in the form of someone important that's no longer with us, and for Peter, that's Gwen. And you know what? This wasn't a bad tie-in, all things considered. It told me enough about that event so that I didn't feel lost without reading it, and still found a way to tie it into Peter's story. But let's be honest, did anyone reading this believe for a single second that Peter would be deemed unworthy and wiped out from existence? Like, he's been a bit of a prick this run, but he's still a decent guy, so where's the tension? What this did though was give Peter the reassurance that he's been lacking up until now, and have some time where he can be the Spidey that we know. Despite the impending doom, he still goes tuxedo shopping with Randy, visits his Aunt May, clears Jameson of his conscience, and tells Miles that he's proud of him, all of which wouldn't be out of character for Peter even if he wasn't being haunted by the ghost of his first love that decides his fate. Although it might just be me, but it was Peter's face in this book that kept haunting me. What's with the eyes? He looks like he should be stalking the lead singer of Cham. But problems aside, the ending scene with Peter and Gwen when he finally could speak to her was pretty great, even if it was just for a moment, and gave him a chance to be honest with himself. It's just that the shine is immediately taken from it when it's revealed that Gwen was also the person that Norman saw, just to remind us that sin's past existed. Like, isn't Harry still dead? Surely there must be a dead ex-wife or two in his past. Like, was Gwen as important to Norman as she was to Peter? But 10 issues in, I didn't think the series was that bad. It was just kind of boring, and lacked anything that sets it apart. The majority of the plotlines seem to be, an enemy of Spider-Man needs his help, he does what they ask, and they turn against him. So imagine my surprise when Ned Leeds, former Hobgoblin, approaches Peter for help, and then the Hobgoblin attacks. This wasn't a bad part of the series, it just felt like treading water considering that the setup was now becoming a staple, and not a very exciting one. This type of storyline only brings the shock factor once, so this could have worked better if it replaced the Tombstone arc as the opening story. Then we also would have got the stuff with Black Cat from the start, which at this stage is continuing down that romantic angle, but if I'm honest, I don't think Wells knew what he wanted for Peter in this sense. There's the obvious, with him splitting up Peter and MJ for no real reason. Black Cat creeps in and out, waiting in the wings like a typical pick-me girl, which really isn't like her. She likes to be chased, and without spoiling too much, she isn't even the main relationship for Peter over this series. She becomes like the fill-in fling when Wells doesn't have anyone else, and let's be real, Felicia deserves better. I didn't mind her at first, quite liked her to be honest, because she was helping Peter, but these are the few fleeting moments that we get with her, and honestly, it's quite repetitive. They don't try anything new with her, and especially after Spence would progress their dynamic when Peter helped her remember the time together, it's a missed opportunity. If Wells had done something amazing with Felicia, I wouldn't have minded him undoing all that work, and I thought that was the way it was going. So at this stage, I didn't mind Peter trying to pursue something with her, even if it isn't the most creative plot. And let's just be honest, if Peter's single, who in the fuck can blame him? She'd be leaving me on red before I could even update my relationship status. And it is just a shame that these issues are illustrated by Romita Jr., whose flat style really misses the key selling point of it. Yeah, I need a cold shower. For some reason, it was by this point I was checked out from Romita Jr. The stuff of his I'd liked early on now instead just looked like his later work in Batman that I wasn't a fan of. Like towards the end of this storyline, there's a scene where pumpkin bombs are raining down and there is zero damage. Also, every time he draws a beaten up Peter, he looks like Marv from Sin City. I got sidetracked there, but Ned comes back to ask Peter for his help as he's following a lead on Roderick Kingsley, the original Hobgoblin who had brainwashed Ned into being a villain. He has evidence that Norman's working with Kingsley and wants Peter to use his connection to get to the bottom of the story. After declining to help, Peter confronts Norman and wants to join their meeting so that he can protect Osborn, but Peter's told the wrong day. Lo and behold, when Spider-Man isn't there, the Hobgoblin attacks. And I just do not care about the short mystery of who is the Hobgoblin this time. How many times have we seen this exact plot? We had the first time where it was Ned, then it was Kingsley, so Wells makes the bold decision for it to be both of them here. Yep, the twist that was shocking in Scream 25 years ago is what we get here. Both Ned and Kingsley have been the Hob to cover each other's tracks, even though there's only been one scene for each of them where the Hobgoblin was in the same location, so they barely made use of this tactic. Like, yeah, I didn't care for this idea, but at least give it a go. You don't have to give up the ghost in the second issue. We do get quite a fun fight between Peter and the goblins along the rooftops, which had the added benefit of Spidey now also having a glider, which is cool, but I'm baffled how we got used to it so quickly, and switched to it being the crux of his style over the webs that he's been using for decades. I can barely change character in Injustice without needing 6 months to get used to it. That's why it comes as a surprise when a fourth golden glider swoops in to save save Peter in the nick of time. This is the Goblin, the project Norman had been working on behind closed doors, which very much looks like every 6th Power Ranger rolled into one. And I'm okay with that. The design is simple and the idea daft, but you know what? It is different and plays more into the "ooh, will he betray Peter or not" idea. But this is his first appearance in the suit, and already there's a huge red flag when he goes too far whilst beating up Ned. Peter has to intervene and it's almost not enough, but if this is how he is the very first time that we see him as the Goblin, then where's the suspense? That possible suspense is further ruined when we close on the reveal that the Queen Goblin had been behind the whole ordeal, even to the point of using the Winkler device on both Kingsley and Ned. She has plans to restore Norman to his true self and bring his sins back to him. This raises so many questions like, am I supposed to know who the Queen Goblin is? And as it closes first part, I can't help but feel that epitomizes how this series has gone so far. There's just a bunch of stuff. Whether it be all the other mob bosses, the debt collector, Paul, the Gold Goblin, the Living Brain, or both of the Hobgoblins, or now the Queen Goblin, it's all just stuff. And besides Tombstone, Wells isn't actively moving any of it forward. But if I'm being honest, I'm still not seeing why there's so much hatred towards this run. No, it isn't great, nor is it giving me any hope that it could be, but I still don't know what makes it so awful. It's spring. Ben Reilly has a plan to get revenge on Peter Parker, with only Janine standing by him. It's summer. Ben stalks Peter's apartment whilst he was working with Norman Osborn to save MJ. A portal opens in front of him, which leads him to Madeline Pryor. She feels his pain. In fact, it's what draws people to Limbo, a place where demons mock them for being clones, but Madeline wants it to be a sanctuary for people like her and Ben, and she knows how she can help him get his revenge. She can lead an attack on New York that can guarantee Ben will take Peter's soul. Wait, I don't care about any of these characters. What's going on? This is Dark Web, the event Wells led that carried across various titles and dares to combine two of the most famously hated ideas in Spider-Man stories: clones and going after Peter's soul. I knew this event was coming up, but I was surprised it was this early on in the run, considering a lot of the storylines so far had barely gotten off the ground. And I'm just gonna say it now, this event is a confusing mess. I can't remember the last time I felt so lost in an event, and I can't imagine it would get better on a reread. I was doomed even from the prelude issue, but in my defense, you can't bring in the Goblin Queen in the very next issue after someone called the Queen Goblin showed up. And the whole experience was worse because there wasn't a lot here that drew me in. Some kind of clone team up is interesting, but I felt like I was being punished for reading the first 13 issues of this rather than reading X-Men Inferno with a Clone Saga. And I'm gonna throw this in here because I don't know where else it'll fit, but these editor notes are near useless. One might say this happened in ASM 875, but the actual issue in question is Volume 5 Issue 74. So why not just say that when in issue earlier you reference Volume 3 A New Mutants, so you know that volumes exist? In fact, there's a single page in this where both numbering formats are referenced within the space of 2 panels. I know this is going to be one of those things that only seems to bother me, but this series can't have it both ways, especially when they don't even use the legacy numbering for this series. Unless, of course, can charge double the price for an anniversary issue. But the main story kicks off with Ben committing to do Madeline's bidding under his new identity of Chasm, and even coerce Venom to join, with the plan unfolding on the day of Harry Osborn's birthday. His friends and family are holding a remembrance event in his honour, and for some reason J. Jonah Jameson's there. Norman struggles with the idea that it wasn't his son, but a clone of Harry that died saving him. Coincidentally, this is when the clone duo of Limbo launch some kind of spell that lets demons possess objects throughout the city. Ben goes to Norman's office, and you know what? I like his chasm design. It's garish, haunting, and looks like it started as one of the bizarre suit variants that you could get in Insomniac's sequel. I also like how Ben planned ahead, and at some point had disguised himself as Peter so that he could access the Gold Goblin suit and sabotage it before the fight even began. But there's not much else that I liked early on. The whole scene of everything becoming a demon reminded me of Transformers 1 when the Cube turned everyone into a Decepticon. I just find Dark Web so odd because it's like it didn't want to be an event, as the ordering of issues felt like an afterthought. Case in point, when Spidey and Chasm face each other, Venom attacks and reveals his allegiance with Limbo. To clear up any confusion, there's a note that says that you can read an issue of Venom to figure out what happened before this scene, and that issue released 2 weeks after this one, and it ain't even in the official reading order until after the next issue of Spider-Man. You want to know what that means to me? I'm not going to bother with any Dark Web issue that isn't written by Wells. If Marvel didn't even care to print them in the right order, Why should I bother reading them? That may feel harsh, but I could forgive the confusing issue release if it at least felt like the scenes had some kind of logical sense to them, because after Venom distracts Peter for a bit, he confronts Madeline, but then Chasm appears again, and I couldn't tell if he was stood in front of Peter or if this was somewhere within Limbo. It doesn't show Chasm with the same people or in the same location, and he literally just left Peter a few pages earlier, so what's with the dramatic introduction? At least what this does is get us to the trailer moments quicker, and the biggest positive I can take from this is that Ed McGuinness hasn't lost his edge. Big, bulky characters are his bread and butter. It's why I loved Loeb's Hulk so much back in the day, and seeing him illustrate the fight between Spidey and Venom was a big highlight of Dark Web. Ewing's Venom was the one series I wanted to read the tie-in issues for, but I also want to check out that run on its own. After all, it's Al Ewing, so it was probably already the greatest series of all time before people had even read it. But I got a kick out of Venom being an antagonist to Spider-Man again. Even if he is being manipulated, Eddie's too much of a hero now, but this dynamic is one that I miss. And you know what? The fight with Chasm was exciting too. Sure, it was so early on in the event that I got the feeling this was just being done so that the story could move in a certain direction, but I can't act like it wasn't enjoyable. There was a lot of emotion and meaning from both guys going into this battle, but once it's over, Chasm sentences Peter to Limbo. And this is where things come to a screeching halt. Long story short, everything's backwards down there. That's the gimmick. People say the opposite of what they mean sometimes, and the demons are the equivalent of humans. There's not a Sinister Six, but the Insidious Six. There's not a Daily Bugle, there's a... Okay, well, there is a Daily Bugle. And there's not a Peter Parker, there's a Parker Peteman. A bit of a pencil push who Peter has to save early on, and I'm not sure we'll see him again. Yet despite the chaos, pavements engulfed in flames, and the blood red sky, this world is so boring, and it's because it tries far too hard to be wacky. The only way I can explain it is when I used to read young adult novels, you could tell early on which ones were trying to tick certain boxes so that they could be lumped in the same category as the Hunger Games, but there was none of the passion or thought that had gone into it. Limbo feels like the comic book version of that. It's trying to be a twisted dimension, but there's no sense that it's a lived-in world beyond what it shows us. As well, I'm glad I didn't bother with any of the other series because the main title didn't have a sense of progress beyond surface level objectives. Peter needs to escape, Ben wants revenge, Madeline wants control, Venom wants his son, and it's okay starting with that, but there's never a sense that any of them have a plan. Ben tries to get Peter to eat a magic apple, and when he doesn't, he just waits. It's as if I'm in limbo reading this. The only one I regret skipping is the X-Men tie-in because he exonerated Madeline, which really played into the main story. But even if I'd read those 3 issues, it still would have felt like a massive leap from her ruling Limbo to wanting to clean up New York. Chasm then becomes king because he needs his final form for the finale, and honestly, if this is dull to listen to, I've tried my best to just keep it to the main points. And hopefully I can save us all some time in this long ass video by saying that the concluding issue is beat by beat what you'd expect for the end of an event. Chasm leads his big final attack, everyone who got a tie-in teams up to defend the good of mankind, everyone gets a panel, for some reason one page is on its side, and eventually the good guys win, with an epilogue where the former hero turned villain hopes for redemption. Trust me, if you've read an event, you've seen this issue played out before, and probably done on a larger and better scale. But with that, finally, Dark Web is over. For as much as I've bagged on it, there were still a few positives that I haven't yet mentioned. Again, the small moments of humour were more hits than misses, especially when Jameson is thought to already be a monster from Limbo. There was also a character introduced, Wreck Rap, but he was the hulking hero version of that Parker Peteman that we saw when Peter entered Limbo. Why does that feel like a tongue twister? Amongst the dreary awkward mess of this event, he brightened it up, and I'm just glad that Wells doesn't repeatedly force him back into the series until I hate him.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
But if I had to give it a cover quote, I'd probably go with, "It's like King in Black, but twice as confusing and 1/10 as rewarding." Spoiler alert, that won't be on the dust jacket to the recently released Dark Web Omnibus. But if you did want to pick up that book or any others and support the channel at the same time, then the best place that you can go if you're in the EU is Comics Bugle. They've been a huge support to this channel, and they've also made it so that they've got the best pre-order prices for anyone in the direct market in the EU. And they also recently released the member rewards program, so that you get points for every purchase that you make that you can then use to discount future orders. I can't recommend them enough, but if you want to try them out for yourself, then make sure you use code WOOFWOOF for €5 off your first order. But if you're not in the EU and you still want to make sure that you can get all your books and support the channel at the same time, then the only place that you need to go is Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire higher order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. To give the run some credit, it switched direction straight after, rather than trying to style it out and act like Dark Web was the future of this series. As we pick up with the situationship between Peter and Felicia as they have a romantic getaway out of the city. And with this kind of setup, I had high hopes. Maybe it could stand on its own and be in a similar vein to the second annual of Tom King's Batman. But honestly, Zeb just... Wait, what? This isn't Zeb writing? It's Joe Kelly? The guy who did the best single issue with Superman, who wrote one of the only Deadpool runs that doesn't make me want to punch myself in the face, who already has experience writing Spider-Man with the Gauntlet. It's the same Joe Kelly? Then why was this issue so ass? Is this run cursed or something? The premise is fun, and I was excited to go back to this dynamic since Peter was finally moving away from moping about MJ and lashing out at everyone. But guess who they bump into the second that they get to the retreat? Yep, MJ and Paul. We were moving out from this shadow that's been there since the beginning of the series. Since seeing Gwen, Peter had left that rut of yearning for MJ, and life seemed to be moving forward until this pulled us right back into that mess. And besides a few lines that got a half smirk out of me, they add zero to this story, other than reminding you that they are here and they still exist. And it's here where I realise that the series has a perpetual problem of being 1 foot in the door and 1 foot out. It doesn't know whether it wants to try something new, or tease us with restoring the past. If you want Peter and MJ split up, then split them up and see where you can take that. If you want to build them back to coming together, or even just retcon it back into existence, that's fine as well, but this series refuses to do either. Instead, there's this odd scene where Peter speaks more like Reed Richards than himself, and the conversation does not flow. It was as if each character was doing a speedrun through all of the witty lines, even if it didn't follow what was being said. I just want to add here that I do realise that MJ and Black Cat had a mini-series together in Dark Web, but even if I had read that, I don't think this moment would have been any less forced. But once that scene's done and doesn't return, the plot can start, as an avalanche is caused by what Peter instantly recognises as shock attack. What they uncover is a fake Sinister Six, which is the third version of this team that we've had so far in this series, and a tech startup demonstration that's led by Rabbit and that Kareem guy. The whole weekend is actually a launch event to make supervillain weapons more accessible, which honestly sounds like this could have led to a far more interesting event than whatever Dark Web was. But at the party, the CEO is murdered, with Rabbit framed for it, and the weapons are used against them. What follows is a collection of action scenes that all feel so disconnected from one another that there's no sense of who's winning. The whole time they're being chased, but there's no gauge of movement. But this doesn't feel like an intentional confusion tactic because Spidey and Black Cat have the whole thing under control quickly, and because they're just imitations of villains that Spidey went up against single-handedly just a few issues earlier. Where's the tension? The main things I liked was the reveal that the CEO guy had faked his death so that he could test everyone, and this ending with Peter and Felicia, him admitting that he loves MJ, but not in the way that he always used to, was a mature and powerful moment, not just for the series, but his character. And I wonder if Wells knew that Kelly was going to do this, especially with the issues that we got coming up. They've been on again, off again, more times than the light in my fridge when I'm snackish, but there was always that sense that the love that they had for each other would bring them back together. For as much as we've seen them work as a couple, if you had a friend that was in this type of scenario, you'd want them to move on as well. Sometimes it's for the best to leave someone you love in the past. I didn't want them to break up, but at least if they are, the best thing they can do is accept it and move forward. So in the very next issue, Peter and MJ are forced back into each other's lives when a tornado emerges in the middle of the city with a man at the centre of it. They all know who it is. Even Paul and the kids can't forget the Scribble Man. Wait, so they're absolutely terrified of this guy, but they give him a name so daft? The cover promises that this is the issue we've been waiting for, but that's a lie because it's not the finale. Instead, it's a story of what happened at the very beginning of the series, and I'm glad this wasn't dragged out until the very end, which I thought might have happened when it didn't get revealed in the first few arcs. But in the same breath, this came about too late, and would have worked better as the introduction. What we get during the flashback is the reveal that Raven is behind everything, a villain Wells made back in 2008 and hasn't been seen since, as he wants to bring about the return of Wayup, the Mayan god of mischief, and marks both Peter and MJ for sacrifice so that the vision Raven saw can come to fruition. When the marks are triggered, MJ and Peter are transported to an alternate New York where the skies run blood red, weird creatures roam the streets, and Yeah, it's kinda similar to Limbo. Here is where they meet Paul, who has been alone on this Earth for years after Wyatt destroyed it for power. He developed tech that can get one of them back to their world, and in the heat of the moment when Wyatt finds them, Mary Jane pushes Peter through the portal, killing Wyatt, but trapping her in Paul's world in the process. Dazed and confused, Peter immediately gets to work on rescuing MJ, which means we're caught up with the opening scene of the series. Yet once he's back in New York, he realizes that time moves faster in Paul's world, meaning Peter has even less time to save the day. So he goes to the Fantastic Four for help, is confronted by Captain America, but with everyone against him, he's forced to go to Norman Osborn. To save MJ, they need to build their own teleportation device, so Spidey breaks into Reed Richards' lab to steal a mini fusion reactor, which is what burnt that bridge in the first place. Norman uses this to develop a reinforced suit, which gets Peter back to MJ, but years have passed in Paul's world, and MJ had given up hope, and she'd started a family instead. Now, this backstory would have been a suitable explanation. If only MJ hadn't been so pissed off with Peter up until this point. Sure, we'd gotten a glimpse at a flashback that showed Peter had lashed out in the time since then, but the guy was gone for a few days, and when he next saw MJ, she'd started a family with another dude. I think we're good to condone a bit of anger there. At the end of the day, she was the one who sent Peter back against his will, so why was she so angry with him? The dude teamed up with his mortal enemy and didn't take a break until he got back to her. What more could he have done? And sure, there's trauma bonding and the kids and the time she spent with Paul, but I just can't see why she'd not choose to get back with Peter. It felt like the last piece of that puzzle was still missing. But I can't lie, I really enjoyed the pace of this backstory. There's the ever-present sense that time is against him, and the recklessness that felt out of place with Tombstone is far more justified here. Even the idea that he can't wait for his fellow heroes, and they don't trust him enough to believe him when he needs them the most, adds an extra layer to how Johnny treated him at the beginning. And this is why this would have landed better had this been the introduction. How much of an impact would that have had? Especially compared to the faux mystery that was a bit of an afterthought. We could have been lulled into a false sense of security with the alternate New York, that this would just be some wacky interdimensional story to kick things off. Similar to the start of Rick Remender's Captain America, or even Bendis' X-Men. But then by the end of it, it could have been this big dynamic shifter that still placed Peter right where Wells wanted him at the beginning. I'm not saying it would have perfected this breakup, but it wouldn't have been this melodramatic hush-hush drawn-out thing for the first 20 issues. Like, do you remember Conquest and Invincible, when it just appeared unannounced, but suddenly it was this huge deal because we weren't expecting it? That's the opposite of what Wells did. It's funny I mention Invincible because up until now, the Peter and MJ situation reminded me exactly of that later story with Monster Girl and Robot, but somehow Wells couldn't maintain my intrigue. Whereas if we got this story out of the gate, it really would have strengthened the tragedy of the whole thing, and not frame Peter as such a villain. If they were really desperate for a mystery, they could have kept the issue from MJ's perspective and use it like they did here. Because, you know what? This wasn't a bad issue either. I'm gonna say it again and take every opportunity to say it, but 25 issues is not worthy of an anniversary special. But this fills in the gap between when Peter left and later returned. We see MJ hope that he comes back and saves her, but becomes a badass in her own right over time. Things blossom with Paul. They find the two kids and decide to bring them along, and that's when I noticed how odd it is that Stephanie looks exactly like MJ. They established time moves quicker in this world, but the kids are just two tag-alongs instead of actually being either of the kids. Is it just guilt that keeps MJ raising them? Did Wells originally plan that to be the case and then realise here having a kid with Paul would be a step too far? And also, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, but Peter's first time there was for a day in his world, but it turned out to be a week in Paul's. Yet he spends a few days working with Norman, and 4 years have passed for MJ. Now, I'm not the best at maths, but that doesn't add up. Yet what this issue did manage to do is paint Paul in a different light, and through MJ found a way to enjoy life again. For the first time, he wasn't just the thing in between Peter and MJ. But I have to ask, what happened to the absolutely jacked to the gills Paul that we saw here? There's no way he lost all that mass in 6 months, so I don't know, maybe he just had a really good pre-workout in his world. But that pretty much brings us back to the present after a few more scenes of cleanup, and Rabin's attack is in full force. But inexplicably, after sort of redeeming Paul, Wells undoes all of that work by revealing that Peter's previous outburst at him was after Paul revealed that Rabin is his father. It's at this point I realised the game was done for Peter. If the fact that she was dating the son of the guy that's trying to kill her couldn't get her to leave Paul, nothing will. She literally found the one guy with more baggage than Peter and said, yeah, he's the one for me. That's not the only inexplicable decision made, because there are two clear objectives whilst Rabin is storming New York. Keep MJ and the kids as far away from Rabin as possible, and defeat Rabin. In the flashback I spoke about, Paul reveals he's defeated 2 emissaries before and has the power to stop Rabin. So, for some daft reason, Paul is left in charge of hiding the kids, and MJ goes to confront Rabin. Like, I don't think these guys want to win. Thankfully, MJ now has Gambit powers for some reason, which barely come in handy. It means she still has to run away and avoid getting killed, which just proves that she should have stayed with the kids. However, that would have robbed us of a moment that was memed to high heaven on release. For once, the collective comic community joined me in my disdain for kid characters, as they were wiped from existence as Paul held them in his arms. And I'm just gonna say it, Romita Jr. was the perfect artist for this moment. Seeing Paul's flat, almost disappointed reaction to losing the kids that he'd raised as his own for 4 years made this one of the most hilarious comic moments. It kinda made up for his Peter always being the most beat up guy in existence, and that weird looking Wolverine in issue 21. The only thing that made this moment better was how perfectly fine Paul looked when he told MJ. In his defense, maybe Romita Jr. was reminding us that Paul never wanted the kids in the first place, but I won't question a good thing. They just dragged the story down, and were the only reason that MJ was with Paul. Honestly though, for a climax to what had been teased since issue 1, this had that gravitas. There was a sense that Rabin was this destructive force who could wreak havoc once again, after we'd finally started to see Peter get his life back together. Norman was there, Kamala, and even the Fantastic Four put aside their disdain for Peter because Rabin posed that big of a threat, even though I don't get why the Fantastic R is now shaped like the Superman symbol. So with the stakes clear, when I saw the cover to this issue, I thought 2 things. 1, there is no way they're killing off Captain America, so take him off the cover. And secondly, as sad as it might be, MJ dying here would make a lot of sense. When you give an established character like hers a power set that makes no sense for her, you've run out of ideas. The dynamic between her and Peter has always been based on how his power comes from being Spider-Man, but she already has status and success as Mary Jane, so as if breaking them up wasn't bad enough, giving her powers just felt like a last-ditch attempt to keep interest in it, while she's only made sporadic appearances. So perhaps it would be best for the story if she was to die. Peter would have to move on, but in a different sense. Paul wouldn't need to remain on this earth, because it would feel as empty as the one that he left, and MJ's death could mean something to this series. So when Rabin does catch up to MJ and completes his quest of taking her as a sacrifice, it was sad. But just like Rabin's cell, the writing was on the wall. Oh wait, it was Kamala disguised as MJ? Yeah, I guess that's sad, like, she was definitely in a few issues of this series. Was this really supposed to feel like a big moment? Sure, Khan had worked with Peter at Oscorp, but she was far from being a key player. But they framed this like a death that should have a big impact, and it doesn't. It only mattered because it led to Rabin's defeat. Pretty much everyone else on that front cover would have been a more meaningful death. It feels disrespectful to Ms. Marvel that she wasn't killed off in a title of her own, and yet that's where this story arc abruptly ends. This really could have been the point where Wells got control of the story, trimmed the baggage that had been weighing it down, and pointed it in a new, interesting direction. But with the ball very much in his hands, he still scored an own goal. And if he couldn't redeem it here with the storyline that the series had been built around, what hope is there for the rest of the run? So where do you take a run that seemingly solved its biggest mystery before the halfway point? A lot of modern runs have me asking that, but it seems the answer is to throw everything at the wall again and see what sticks. Black Cat is alongside a rage-filled Peter, who's taken his grief over Kamala's sacrifice out on the likes of Shocker, but at least it's not because of MJ that he's being vengeful now. But just as it looks like it's set on this darker direction, Otto is back to destroy the tentacles that betrayed him, and reveals that he injected his set with a nanofluid that carries his consciousness within them. And I'm sorry, but what the fuck is Ock made? But with the traitorous tentacles barely surviving the attack, they seek the last person that showed them kindness, J. Jonah Jameson. He rushes them to Oscorp for help. Norman declines, but Peter convinces him, despite the fact that Norman is the only one not acting on emotion at this point. But you know what? If it wanted to go in this wacky direction, then I'm all for it. The humour in this series worked far better than the drama, so why not lean into that? But the thing is, it needs to lean in fully, and Wells refuses to. There's still this undertone of Peter's rage getting the best of him, and he occasionally remembers that Kamala died, so it has characters be depressed about that. and that's sandwiched awkwardly between Otto's plan to get back at Norman, who walks right into Oscorp Labs, as his new Octoids can literally do anything that he needs them to: break down doors, infiltrate security systems, and even email the receptionist's ex-boyfriend. It's kind of funny how overpowered they are. The science jargon was so heavy that I can't even doubt if they'd be this capable, but I didn't think it should be this easy. You'd expect Oscorp to have some kind of advanced security system, but when the story's enjoyable, I'll forgive a few contrivances. And against the baggage it was carrying from before, this storyline was fun. This is the type of plot we should be getting whilst Norman's in his hero era. His sins may be cleansed, but he should still have to answer to those that he's wronged. There's also a deepening of this idea because Otto later injects Norman with the Goblin serum, but he doesn't take because the evil that was inside of him is gone. Yeah, it feels like there's a retcon in there because the serum has tainted some pretty moral people in the past, but it's nice that Wells is exploring the idea more, even amongst the wackiness of it all. To add to that, Jonah was fun in this arc, even if he was acting like a hysterical parent over the tentacles and throwing all logic to the side for their well-being. Jameson is a bit like Black Cat in this run, in that there's no rhyme or reason to his appearances, but taking it scene by scene, there's not one with him that I didn't find entertaining. McGinnis back on the art helped, because his range of facial expressions is so much deeper than the one grimace that Romita Jr. does, and the fight scenes became so much more dynamic and interesting than they were during Rabin's attack. He also draws a new Spidey suit in a way that makes it look more natural, and shows off how this design can work without it feeling like a mismatch. But just as soon as a warm-up to the suit, Peter reverts back to his classic look, and the story doesn't explain why. After Rock kidnaps Norman and suffocates Peter unconscious, he next wakes up having been saved by the excommunicated tentacles and Jameson. However, they need to stop Otto, and the tentacles invite Peter to fuse with them via a neural link, which, if Peter is as smart as they claim, should be the last thing that he willingly does, because even I can tell from idea alone that this won't end well. And I'm dumb as shit. Otto's already shown that he recently developed tech that could outsmart every angle of Oscorp's entire company, and Otto's so smart that he managed to trick Peter out of his own body. Are you telling me there's not a single way they can track a signal coming from the gold Goblin suit? Or follow the wake of carnage left by Ock? If this truly is his last option, he'd be better off calling the Fantastic Four for help and waiting the 3 business days for a response. But against the better judgment of, well, everyone, Peter fuses with the tentacles and halts his immediate mission of saving Norman so that he can give them a Spidey rebranding, because the biggest crime has not been fashionable. Like, I'm not against this hybrid, especially if this wants to be a wacky series. I just don't get why the neural link is completely glossed over, especially since either he or Norman need to be thinking straight, which isn't an option for the latter since Otto has him prisoner, and this is where he injects him with the Goblin serum. But when this doesn't take, Otto instead opts to kill him with some complex coil, as if he couldn't just do it with the tentacles that were holding him prisoner, all of which gives Peter time to use the arms to track them down, and it also gives us another fun fight. It's a tad too short for my liking, especially since it has a one-trick pony with the Spidey tentacles. Why not make this longer, and show the full capabilities of Peter with Otto's tech? The reason I say this is because, and I can't believe there were no warnings, but connecting to the tentacles via a neural link immediately turns out to be a bad idea. When Peter gets Otto, the tentacles tell him to finish the job, and it's only Norman who can snap him out of the trance. But it isn't just Peter in a trance, because I could have sworn that I saw Wreck Rap around this time, which would make no sense. He's not been in this series since Dark Web, and he's not even in this arc, so it must be me in a trance surely. But having Norman be the voice of reason for Peter really bolstered this storyline, and reinforced that he's on the side of good now. This was enough on its own, without the forced scene where he reminisces about Kamala. After the awkward deal, he talks about a time where she joked about putting Goblin serum in his coffee, and that is a sweet moment. If we'd seen it. This felt so forced, and honestly, I thought the characters had moved on already because she was mentioned so little. If anything, take out this scene, and the opening one with Black Cat, and you wouldn't know she died. So am I really supposed to feel the weight of her death that Norman's going through? Hold that thought though, because here's a far more important question. Why the hell is issue 31 quadruple sized? Especially since over half of this issue is advertising other series that Wells isn't even writing. Is it really to celebrate the wedding of Randy and Janice because they haven't had a proper appearance in over 20 issues? Or is it just because the legacy numbering that this one still isn't using is at 925? Because I don't see the need for a 25th issue to be an anniversary, let alone if the discarded legacy numbering hits that. And of all the Oversized specials, this one's the least warranted. There's a prelude where Tombstone gathers the crime families to invite them to the wedding, and literally everyone at this table speaks in foreshadowing. Then to get even more pages in, we have the dragged out night before parties. And Randy's had the exact same emotions I felt whilst reading this issue, whereas Janice's is all laughs and she tries to get Black Cat to join the syndicate. But this heart-to-heart leads to Felicia waiting for Peter outside of his apartment so that she can break up with him, claiming that she knows his heart isn't in it because he isn't trying to make her a hero. And to all the kings watching this, here's a little bit of advice. If your girlfriend ever breaks up with you out of the blue after she just went to a bachelorette party and mostly blames you, she probably slept with the stripper in a toilet. The funniest part is that the narration box after the breakup says that things should be nice and boring from this point. But this whole issue's boring. Janice and Randy have been pushed so far into the background with Dark Web, Rabian and Ock that I couldn't remember if they were still getting married. The allegedly wild bachelorette party was dragged out, Randy was a misery, and we could have just had the scene with Felicia and Peter and cut all of this. Tom King did the exact setup in Batman, but he made it work, so I don't have much sympathy for Wells. There was already a blueprint there. The wedding itself doesn't improve things, as there are just pages on pages of people finding the seats, doing things behind the scenes, and just signposting that something will pop off eventually, so please keep reading. Peter says Randy's face makes it all worthy, whilst he has the most nonchalant smile that I've ever seen, so I can say with 100% confidence that I've never been so happy to see someone start shooting at a wedding when Blade Rider comes crashing in to assassinate Tombstone. And yeah, I know his name's Shotgun, but that's lazy, so I'm just gonna stick with Blade Rider. Although I kind of have to eat my own words because I did like how everything descended into pure chaos after he crashed through. The reveal that Tombstone is wounded was great, Spidey leapt into action, Hammerhead made a move on Madam Mask, and even how it just felt unresolved at the end. It was easily the best part of this issue. What's best is how they set up Gang War, which the seeds have been there for since issue 1. Sure, it's largely been forgotten since then, but this was a smart way of bringing it back in focus. And I much preferred this approach, more than the sudden drop into Dark Web that we had to endure. But I did get a bit bored with all the additional stories at the end, especially since Wells didn't do many of them, besides a scene reminding us that Kamal is still dead, and one with Kraven. But the most apt thing that this issue did was end with a snippet from Reign 2. And here's a tip. Calling it the most notorious Spider-Man story is just a polite way of saying it's awful. Yet the most baffling thing about this is that Gang War is foreshadowed more than the Kraven story that starts straight after. There is one short scene that's mixed in with everything else, but it's just odd because it's so easy to skip it, which, you know, I definitely didn't do the first time. But after not doing much since the Hobgoblin reveal, Queen Goblin hooks up with Kraven after they try to kill each other, and he then immediately jumps on board with her plan to ruin Norman's life. And in a universe that literally has a character that eats planets, all of Norman's sins being confined to a spear that they want to stab Norman with may be the dumbest idea that I've ever heard of. Where are the sins of everyone else that Sin Eater cleansed? And how did they get transferred to a spear without getting those sins on whoever was transferring them? Meanwhile, Peter's dealing with the fallout of the almost wedding as he negotiates the relationship with Janice's friend Michelle. And you know what? I like this. It shows how Wells can very quickly establish dynamics that feel natural and pique my interest. So it's disappointing that he didn't bring this in earlier, or channel it more with the time spent with Black Cat, because I like the reveal that Michelle was Tombstone's lawyer, and how she found a way to justify that. But with things having not gone his way, Peter visits Oscorp at the dead of night, with Norman being the only person at the lab. And it was here where I realised that the Goblin spin-off that wasn't even written by Wells seemed to be the linchpin for the Spider-Man series. Was I also supposed to be reading Spider-Woman, Superior, the Mary Jane spin-off, and every other series that was introduced through this? But I checked out Goblin after the fact, and it ends with Norman killing the Queen Goblin as she tries to return his sins. And this seems to be a first appearance since then. So with Kraven's help and the flimsy Oscorp defense, they break in with enough time to set up a ridiculous mural to initiate the process of stabbing Norman's sins back into him. And when I read this, I could have sworn that I won the award for the loudest eye roll, because if it wasn't predictable enough, Peter is the one who gets infected with Norman's sins. What are we doing here? Is every story just going to be Peter merging with these villains? It was Ock before this, now it's Goblin. And is he just going to turn into sand in the next arc? It was already nonsensical enough that after the meeting with Michelle, he would go back to the lab, rather than go back to his apartment, or to see Randy, Aunt May, or pretty much do anything that we've seen him do so far to unwind. And it's all highlighting again that the book just takes the easiest option to keep things moving, rather than tell the best story. This leads to what seems to be a staple in modern Spider-Man runs, an out-of-nowhere homage to Kraven's Last Hunt. And I might get some hate for this, but it was fun in the dumb kind of way. It's nowhere near the original, and there is zero reason beyond the homage why Peter is in the black suit, but I feel like it knows it won't compare, and it just has fun with it. It plays out like a reverse Kraven's Last Hunt, with a brutal, rage-filled Peter vying for Kraven, and willing to take down everyone in his way. But I have to wonder, what was Kraven's plan if he had stabbed Norman, since he was so underprepared for someone to attack him, to the point where he couldn't stand a chance against Peter? Although, if I'm chalking it up to wanting this wacky direction, it does work, and was a better homage to Kraven's Last Hunt than whatever Hunted was. And having Patrick Gleason on art is enough of a reason to make this readable. He's one of those dudes that I never realised just how many titles he jumps between, but there's never a massive dip in quality. I loved the way he toyed with shadows to give that sense that Peter was always lurking in the darkness, and from his paneling to the positioning of characters, it has a more cinematic quality that was fantastic to see. It was because of Gleason that there was one of the biggest laugh out loud moments of the series. We cut to Tombstone on life support, Janice wondering if he'll pull through, when a beat rings throughout the building. Someone unplugged the machine, and we just see a foot leap out of the window, and a black suit Spider-Man swing through the night. How is that not hilarious? The dude just buried Kraven and was like, let's swing to the other side of town because fuck Kraven, he ain't dying quick enough. And with vengeance on the brain, Norman drags Paul and MJ back into the story, fearing that Peter may come for them next. And despite hating how contrived it was to get to this story, this is a logical step for how out of control Peter's been for the majority of the series. He has been more aggressive, acting first and thinking last, but no one really presses him on it. So maybe the best thing to do is to take it to the absolute extreme and confront it head on. Sometimes with a run like this, you have to enjoy what you can, which is why I was hyped when Norman dug Kraven up so that they could save the day, which gave us another scrappy brawl that shows how much Peter's holding back on a daily basis. And people can say what they want about this series, but I am enjoying more of these fights than I'm not. What I'm not enjoying is how MJ's now Gambit for some reason. This is such a fundamental change to the core of her character that it needed to have more of an explanation in the Spider-Man series. We haven't seen her since Raven attacked, and her powers made no sense there, but she can now manifest the energy into playing cards. We already have a Gambit, he's great, so if you want a Gambit-like character, use Gambit. Unless he's dead or something, I never know anymore. As well, she and Paul are literally just waiting for the series to need them. The only role Paul serves in this arc is bait for Peter, and I thought after the backlash to him not dying in the Raven arc, maybe Wells forced him in here so he could be killed off in a way that services the storyline. But no, so instead, this feels like it's trying to be a symbiote arc, but without needing to actually bring in the symbiote, and just turning Peter's anger up to 11 so that he's the most vicious that we've ever seen. It's one of those odd scenarios that if you turn your brain off, it's popcorn fun, but the second you think of anything on the page, it falls apart. What piqued my interest though is the closer, that slowly the Goblin is creeping back into Norman, presenting us with the question of whether he can truly be cleansed of his sins, or if this is who he is. After having Norman be the one to devise the plan to save Peter, and this still be the result, I can't help but want to see how this plays out. What I didn't care about seeing play out was anything from Dark Web. That goes for both Limbo and Rec Rap. Sure, he was a fun novelty that made Dark Web less bleak, but through more time with him, I can see how he isn't thought out at all, because since Dark Web, Rec Rap and other creatures from Limbo are in New York, but haven't adjusted to life on the surface world as much as Madeline would have hoped. Rec Rap has the task of bringing in demons that are causing chaos, but often leaves more destruction in his wake by doing so. One trail leads him to Peter's building where the two cross paths before they're confronted by Repo, the demon in charge of repossessions in Limbo, but has recently gone against Madeline's orders, which is a case that Rec Rap had been investigating. Now this guy has an eerie, intimidating presence. He's like a serial killer with how emotionless and calculating he is, with a design which I liked. It reminds me of all the body horror stuff from The Thing. After swallowing Rec Rap, Peter becomes his obsession, repeatedly claiming there's a debt to pay, and even kidnaps Randy as collateral. Before Peter can get any answers, he's captured by Repo and sent back to Limbo, where 10 seconds in Earth time is a day down there, which, you know, just seems to be the gimmick with every alternate location in this series. But I'm not sure if that's actual science, or just how it must feel when you're with Rec Rap, because by God did he serve no purpose in this. I realised as well that I don't understand what this character is, because I thought he was basically Bizarro for Spider-Man, but the logic of the way he speaks isn't consistent. Sometimes he means the opposite of what he says, or has different names for things, but then other times he doesn't, or can speak perfectly normal. If anything, he was an active hindrance to Peter getting back to with, and I don't know if Repo would have even got to him in the first place if it wasn't for Rec Rap. Yet for some reason he's brought along as painful comedic relief, and until they find a way out of repo, which I don't want to think about how that works. But this does mean the debt hasn't been paid. The one repo felt an obligation to betray Madeline for so it could be collected. Wait, debt and collecting? Yep. Repo's actually the debt collector who's been there since issue 1, but was a whole mystery around the debt collector, something that needed a payoff after 35 issues. Had anyone been wondering where this guy was? I kinda forgot he was a factor. I thought Peter had just got his finances in order. Sure, it turns out that partway through the original collector was possessed by Repo, but just because something has been there from the beginning doesn't automatically mean any reveal about them is shocking. I just don't know what this series is even trying to do anymore. All throughout this storyline there are these interludes and a hard cut at the end to tease gang war, so why not just make these 3 issues a whole prelude to that? It's had way more of the series focus from the start than the debt collector or rec rap, but at the same time had recently fallen to the side, and the storyline after this is gang war, so it would have felt far more linear. There's no need to be invested in anything because there's no sense it could matter in a few issues. The relationship between Black Cat was billed as a big thing until it ended after one conversation. The beef with the Fantastic Four is a nothing element, and did Paul and MJ just evaporate out of this book after the Craven story? I checked and there's no mention that they left town, or are they just waiting to be relevant again at some point in the future? The only major glimmer of hope is that we are finally at gang war, which besides MJ and Paul is the only thing that has had weight since the beginning. Wells had time to plot everything out, think about the logistics and not rush into it like Dark Web. And just like with Dark Web, if you think I'm going to read all of the non-Wells issues, you can... Hold on. Hello? Yeah, I'm just doing the recording now. What? But, oh, come on, there's so many, it'll be pointless. I did the same thing for Dark Web, it'll be fine. What? Contractually obliged? What contract? This is my channel. Come on, let's be real, most of the people who leave hate comments are too stupid to get to this point in the video. Okay, fine, I'll read them. I guess it makes sense. If gang war is what this series has been building up to, we might as well do it properly. I'm gonna start this by saying that gang war isn't that bad of an event, but in hindsight this should have had even more of the focus from early on, as it was only really the opening story and Randy's wedding that gave the sense that something big was coming, but because everything else had been set up in interludes, this feels like a mountain out of a molehill. But in saying that, the on the ground gang type stories had been far more enjoyable than whatever category we have to put rec rap and limbo in, so I was optimistic for this. Following on from his wedding, Randy's been campaigning for the Fisk Act, which outlawed vigilantes to be overturned, even though New York still has an abundance of them. But this forces Hammerhead to put a hit out on him that he wants Janice to complete, otherwise the alliance between the crime families means nothing. Meanwhile, Randy's working closely with Mayor Cage to legalize heroes, but Janice is already en route to take him out. She confronts him in an alleyway, and despite my complaints about the focus on these two, you could feel how hard this decision is for Janice, and it was kinda hard to watch unfold. But Hammerhead never trusted that she'd follow through, so he sends a goon squad for the couple, and Randy jumps in front of his former love but is hospitalized as a result. Now, as a catalyst to set things in motion, this works far better than a lot of the contrivances that have been used to kick off other storylines, but it surprisingly doesn't have much of an impact on Peter. Sure, we get the scene where he learns about the shooting and visits him whilst he's unconscious, but that's also the exact moment when all the factions across New York launch their assault for control. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad the gang war started in a big way, but it's just irritating that Wells has spent so long trying to make me care about Randy, but even Peter didn't seem to care that much. Although, in saying that, Peter doesn't even seem to mean much to this whole event. Besides a really pointless scene between him and Miles early on, which side note made no sense because Peter had a heart-to-heart with Miles during the AEX issue, so why is he still mad about being ghosted before that? But yeah, besides that forced drama, Peter is mostly just standing near other characters who were moving the plot forward. Prime example, he quickly assembles a team with Miles, Jessica and Elektra, but they're mostly just following She-Hulk. That may have been for the best though, because this event is full on chaos, and it wasn't just about Spider-Man, so it needed to make that clear, and for the most part, succeeds in that. There's fighting going on everywhere, characters popping up and throwing a wrench in the works, plot lines that seem long forgotten about, but it's all done in an enjoyable way. It wasn't a chore to read this in the same way that Dark Web was, but it's why I think this is one of those events that only works if you read all the tie-ins. Each one covers a different area in New York, so without the context of what goes on there, you just have the map at the beginning, which quite frankly was a lifesaver in getting through this. The first time I read this, I only did the Spider-Man issues, and as a dirty Brit who can't be bothered to memorize the geography of New York, I had no clue who was going for what, or where that was in relation to other territories, but the map simplified it, so thank God for the map. The main story does continue in Spider-Man, but I quite enjoyed the first few issues of the Luke Cage spin-off. He's been a peripheral character in the series, whereas I think his turn as mayor is a fascinating angle for the character that hasn't been fully explored. I kinda wish we could have a full ongoing series where he's towing the line between bureaucracy and heroism, but following a potentially fatal shooting, it leads Luke on a trail that has him cross paths with the creator of the Spider Slayers, Alistair Smythe, and then the whole thing goes off the rails. There was potential here, but it quickly fell in line with everything else to drag in a connection to a D-list Spider-Man villain, whereas a political thriller would have been a completely different tone to everything else that was going on. At least he assembled his own team that did play into the final battle, but by God did they give him an awful redesign early on. So much so that when he did get the cage busted by the end, I didn't think it looked daft. But whilst it's good how the side titles fleshed out the world, the main Spider-Man series did push the key players to the front of the battle. I somehow was rooting for Tombstone now. He left the hospital at the beginning of the event and teamed up with Spider-Man again so that they could hopefully prevent more chaos. You know, enemy of me enemy type stuff. Whilst at the same time, Madam Mask was established as a huge threat early on. There was a phenomenal moment in the prelude issue where she took out Hammerhead, then also took out the Padding in a bra, despite the fact that she's clearly fine as hell without them. So even though I couldn't fully track what every faction was doing, this signposted well who the key players were and the moves that they made. Even more so when Kingpin's thrown into the mix. It wouldn't feel like a crime war for New York without him, and despite him not being in the series before this, just the reveal of him was intimidating and felt like a wrench thrown into everything. Oh wait, that was short-lived. As Wilson tried to make a deal, but he and Tombstone immediately started fighting, and by that I mean they just headbutted each other a lot. If anything, Shang-Chi was more of an antagonist in this than Kingpin. Jumping into his spin-off made me realise that I know absolutely nothing about him in the comic universe, because I never realised he was a factor in this gang war, but his title added an interesting moral dilemma that was missing from the main book. There's a lot of talk about if Shang is trying to protect Chinatown from the surrounding gangs, or if he's trying to help the Five Weapons Society take over. Although I wasn't a huge fan of the art, and the font of the speech kept changing, some of this should have been in the main series. Given that this involves Shang tricking 3 of the factions into fighting each other, and Spider-Man leading a team to stop him, and that's part of the problem. There were so many factions to the point where entire stories don't get any of the focus in the main series. This could have benefited from having fewer territories to start with, and give us more time with each of them in the build-up. Similar to Daredevil Season 1, as we only really saw from Janice, Tombstone and a bit from the Rose. As a result, they were mostly relying on name recognition, and some of the territories were just waiting to be taken over, and it becomes evident very early on that Mask and Janice are going to be the main players, and there could have been more uncertainty. Another thing I was uncertain about is why the art in most of these side titles was better than in the Spider-Man series. Case in point, Daredevil. I can't recall seeing Sergio Davila work on something before, but they had such a dynamic and vibrant style that should have been front and centre. Yet when it comes to the story here, it was just okay. Perhaps it's because when Daredevil is in the title, I have high expectations. Or maybe it's because Zdarsky laid out a great blueprint for a gang war story in his recent run. But something about this Daredevil tie-in felt like a missed opportunity. It started well with how it was integrated with the ASM series, and when the Hand and the Owl are thrown into the mix, it prevents this from being boring. But most of it centers around this mystery assassin that's some clone of X-23, and it just doesn't do much for the gang war plot, which is a disappointment because when it comes to the main storyline, Elektra's there, front and center. So it's like a spin-off was scared of messing that up to the point where it was just random and too safe. Although, maybe Beetle's new design could have taken that mantra, because this weird gimp suit was not a good choice. The first Luke Cage suit in his series should thank Beetle for saving him from being the worst design I've seen in a good long while. You know it's bad when she's positioned as a sympathetic villain, but I wanted Mask to win so that I didn't have to see this suit anymore. That could also be a problem due to the art, because when we get to the final battle in Central Park, the whole thing was flat and lacked that rhythm where you can see the cause and effect. It was about as tense as when the Krellboynes go into the regular class and Malcolm in the Middle. The backgrounds are lacking to the point where it doesn't feel like a huge brawl's going on, but there are just two girl bosses seeing whose small army will win. It's similar to the Joe Kelly issues in that it feels more focused on quips than having any sense of cohesion or a tense conclusion to this war for New York. It probably wouldn't have been so bad if the quips were good at least. Tombstone and Blade Rider have a back and forth where they take it in turns telling each other to eat something, but this is the first time they're face to face since the assassination attempt at his daughter's wedding. The Tombstone from the start of the series wouldn't be quipping here, so why now? He was more serious when he was dethroning Janice, to the point where I wonder if he was secretly working with Blade Rider by comparison. When I started this review, I wondered if Randy was enough of an emotional linchpin, but maybe he was never meant to be. Perhaps instead it was about the total corruption of Tombstone and the complexities of fatherhood. Norman is probably the closest thing Peter has now to a father figure, and the bond between the two has taken so long to mend and could be destroyed in an instant. Whilst Osborn himself has briefly touched on life since losing a child, Randy's relationship with his dad has been murky due to his political moves, but now Robbie's facing the thought of losing his child, a reality that Paul's already had to face, even though he never wanted to step into the father role. Perhaps that's why he was thrown into this run, to add another layer to the emotional core of fatherhood. Nah, that's still not enough to make me like him. But my point is that Tombstone's dethroning of Janice is both selfish, but done so that he can protect her in the only way that he knows how. It made sense for this storyline, and also what we've seen of this character, and was easily the best part of this finale that didn't give any sense it was rising to a climax. However, I don't care what kind of new Beetle Gimp armor she's got, she would be dead if she took a punch to the back of the head from Tombstone. It's a good job that paid off though, because if Randy had been the only emotional pull, this would have fallen flat on its face, as he conveniently regains consciousness just as the war is over and Fisk's law has been repealed. Like, if you don't want to do any more work, just pull a sickie. Healthcare over there ain't cheap. However, it was funny hearing Peter's rendition of the gang war, because he said every hero that you've ever heard of pitched in when I could have sworn there was less than 10. Like, the Fantastic Four and Captain America have been in this series and still didn't show up. I'm still not a fan of how integral he and Janice have been to certain storylines, but at least the focus was coming back around again to Tombstone, because him ending the event as this looming presence over New York City is quite interesting, and I've said the entire time that the gang level stuff has been the most coherent part of this run, and despite how bad some parts of this run had been, Gang War was a sign that it could possibly turn things around. But Wells does have the unfortunate disadvantage of me having read Tom Taylor's Nightwing just before this, because the whole scenario reminded me of everything with Blockbuster. Yet could it be possible that Wells gets a second wind in the final third of this run? Perhaps the backlash to the early part of this series turned people away before he could truly show what he was capable of. Maybe, just maybe, Wells could turn the seemingly insurmountable tide, but at a point when it was already too late. Well, that hope was short-lived. I genuinely thought I'd skipped ahead 6 issues after Gang War, and even if I had known that that would be the case, I never expected the barrier to be MJ's aunt. Apparently, she took some cocoa medicine that sent her over the edge, which got her locked up in Ravencroft, where Spidey's trying to slip past an orderly so that he can give her the antidote. I'm just glad that this problem that I had no idea existed is solved before I even had to Google it for context. But I'm gonna get the tinfoil hat out, because I reckon the sole reason this plot existed was to rush MJ back into the series again. I'm still not a fan of her being Jackpot even after reading a Gang War tie-in, and it would have been better off writing out MJ and just making a new character instead, because that's what she feels like here. It's respectable how they're treating her as an emerging hero, rather than throwing her into the mix against the likes of Doc Ock, but the whole scenario hammered home the biggest problem of this run. It can't juggle anything. Think about how mental this is. If you skip the Gang War tie-in, Mary Jane, the former love of Peter's life, shows up as a full-time superhero and there is zero explanation. I could suspend my belief with a lot of things, and even when Shang-Chi popped up as a villain, I was like, no idea what's going on, but let's see how it goes, because I knew I hadn't read anything Shang-Chi focused prior to this, and it must have happened somewhere else. But MJ rocks up with Gambit powers, puts on a costume in an epilogue of the wedding issue, had one tie-in outside of this series, and I'm just expected to act like something ain't wrong here. Had this been better managed amongst the other plot lines, there's a slim chance it could have felt more organic. But it's like that with all the stories, because it wasn't until I saw them having lunch together that I noticed Norman hadn't been involved in gang war, so Wells could have done himself a favour and focused now on what was already in motion rather than forcing Mary Jane's aunt into the story so that we could see her as jackpot. Because her and Peter meet up so that they can visit Anna for some reason, and this gives Peter the chance to have a wholesome scene with Sandman, a new reformed version who turned himself in and no longer goes by Flint Marco. He tells Peter to warn Spider-Man that Otto's planning something, before we cut to a shot of Ock with 4 other villains. So guess where this is going? To give Wells some credit, besides the jackpot stuff, I like that element of MJ and Peter finding excuses to still be in each other's lives, and navigate this post-breakup life whilst they still have feelings for each other that they can't act on. There's still pain shared at what was taken from them because of Rabin, but a somber acceptancy is gone, and Wells illustrated that with nuance in the dialogue. What was also illustrated well was the issues done here by Carmen Canero. She's only on for a couple, but I do like her style when it comes to the villains, although her human faces looked a bit too airbrushed. But after Gang War, it was a nice style change. What's also a nice change is a love interest. I completely forgot Tombstone's lawyer Michelle was a factor in this run, but she's written out here after Peter apparently arranged a date and bailed. At the same time, Aunt Anna's orderly Shay flirts with Peter a bit, which is a thread that develops until the end. But at first I did think she was introduced so that she could die when Elektra led an assault on Ravencroft. Wells gave us a sadistic and unnerving version of Max Dillon as he attempts to break out Sandman, and I like the dynamic that Wells is building between his Sinister Six. I can't lie, it's working better for me than when Spencer tried it. But his Sandman confuses me. Has he got a split personality dynamic going on now? He voluntarily went to prison, declined the breakout, just to stage a breakout of his own accord the next day. If Wells wanted to explore a reformed Sandman, that could have had potential, and see how Ock works when things don't go exactly to plan. Maybe bring in Tombstone as a replacement now he's King of New York, I don't know. I reckon Sandman was only at Ravencroft to give us an Electro action scene, but the aunt was only there so that we could get to Sandman. It's okay to take a more direct route sometimes. I've come to terms with the fact that sometimes Sandman might appear as a villain, but it is gearing things up again in the same way that we got with Gang War. So maybe I'm gullible, but ending with a cliffhanger with the Sinister Six assembling leaves me with only one question. Why the hell is it immediately followed with more bullshit about Chasm? Like, can a proper storyline just start? I want to care. I want to buy into these teases and have something happen without needing to read a completely different title just to understand what's going on. Oh, don't tell me you missed a one-shot web of Spider-Man that told you this story was coming up. You know what, Zeb? Maybe I did. It seems you missed the writing duties on that story, so don't come at me with these judgy little editor notes. And I'm gonna be honest, I was so checked out from Chasm before they threw in the Queen Goblin, so it was like 2 of the weakest storylines were having a baby. Sure, I could Google what the plot was here, but it's a more fair representation of this storyline to point out that I can't remember a single point from it, nor felt the need to make any meaningful notes whilst reading it. There were just a bunch of MacGuffins each person was going after. That's all I remember, but at least we end on another tease of Ock assembling the Six. Everyone is there, they all want revenge on the living brain, this is finally happening. And then we get a tie into Blood Hunt. This was a 5-issue event from 2024 that was written by Jed McKay and centered around the rise of the Vampire Nation with people being infected all across New York. I didn't mind this tie-in, even if it did disrupt the flow of Ock's plan, but I was completely baffled as to why it existed when there's already a separate Spider-Man Blood Hunt miniseries that isn't written by Zeb, and just uses this to springboard into it. But I treated this like a Treehouse of Horror episode of ASM. Romita Jr. was back on the art, and I feel like I'm just bullying him at this point, but I can't not mention how goofy looking it was when he drew people flying. Well, then in the next scene, the sky would be inexplicably blank. But this is kind of the standard event tie-in, meaning that Spider-Man doesn't do much that connects to the main event, nor has anything happened that would be detrimental to any of the 9,000 ongoing storylines that Wells has. There was some decent banter between Peter and Kareem as he tries to help the rabbit, and Spidey also has a nice heart-to-heart with a civilian that felt guilty for what they'd done whilst they were a vampire. What that brings us to is issue 50, which has been billed as the biggest of Wells's run, which yep, of course, means it's got a ridiculous number of pages so that they can drive up the cover price. Peter's called because a living brain produced a message that states that he's not Spider-Man. Confused, he visits Norman, and reveals that there was a second message made up of 3 words that when spoken reveal that Norman was hiding the Green Goblin gear the entire time. But I really like this issue. Not the story arc, but the issue where the shit fully hits the fan. This isn't much of a compliment, but this was the one storyline where it felt like there was a worthy payoff. The fight that follows was brutal, illustrated amazingly, and had that emotion behind it. Over the course of this run, I'd gone back and forth on whether or not Norman had changed. He'd done more than enough to gain Peter's trust. He'd reinvented himself as the Gold Goblin and rid himself of the green image. There'd been opportunities for him to revert back to his old ways, but at the same time, Wells had sprinkled in enough doubt so that I couldn't be certain that the Goblin was gone. I have to admit, this reveal got me. It might just be me being a dumb reader, but fine, because for the first time, I was truly surprised without being baffled. I do kinda wish there'd been some resistance from Norman, like the dude didn't even try the "I keep it there to remind me of who I can never go back to being." He's just immediately in kill mode, whereas Wells could have had one last twist to the knife if Norman had tried to talk it out. But instead, the twist that we do get is that Norman previously used the Winkler device on Peter to plant a coded phrase that when spoken, activates and, say it with me, an evil Spider-Man. You know what? It's my fault for enjoying this issue too much. It's as if Wells was like, oh, you're a fan of people turning evil? Well, what about Peter? I can turn him evil, wouldn't that be wild? I'm gonna go ahead and pencil it in. One evil Peter coming up. I don't know what Zeb Wells sounds like. This, along with the reintroduction of Kraven, yet again has me baffled. Kraven was stood there the entire time that Ock was talking about his plan, yet it's supposed to be a big reveal that he's back and going for the spear again, as well as just doing laps of the same plot points. I'm annoyed because I thought the Goblin spider design was badass, but I hate everything it represents. Honestly, it's like a fun cosplay idea that somehow made its way into continuity. But did Peter just have this design line around? Has he turned evil that many times recently that he kept it just in case? Or did Norman design this? Was there a fourth code word in his office that would have revealed this? Did Norman have to get Peter into the suit, or did he calm down enough that he could do it himself? Regardless, Norman makes Peter target the Sinister Six, which bullses up Ock's plan and leaves him open for attack. Probably why they spent most of the issue waiting around to be attacked. Peter solos all of them with ease, and it was kind of fun to watch, even if I still think the setup is nonsense. The way he saw through Mysterio's illusions, neutralized Ock, embodied Kraven, showed how capable Peter could be if he leaned into the rage. So much so that the only person who can stop him is Chasm. Great. Meanwhile, the Living Brain's determined to save the day and assembles a team whilst Chasm and Peter fight. He gathers Kurt Connors, Jameson, and the Tentacles, and after she's palmed off by Norman, Kamala joins the mix. She's confronted by the, hold up, since when's Kamala alive? Like, I know I can't be surprised that a comic character's back from the dead, but normally they make a point of explaining how that happened. She died in this Spider-Man book, so why can't they tell us how she's here now? Maybe it's just me being a complete casual, but I have no idea what happened here. At least I can explain that away with death is meaningless in this universe, but even that doesn't help me understand how the psychoreactive goo in Chasm's head was the key to saving Peter. I didn't make up that name, by the way, that's what Ben himself calls it. So is this always his plan? Did he know Peter would squeeze his head so hard that it would spray over him? Because that's not a guaranteed Spider-Man attack. What if it squirted the other way? And how did it make his suit go back to normal if Ben was certain that he was gonna kill him? I couldn't believe this was honestly the solution to this mess. But with his mind magically restored, Peter takes Kraven's sin-stealing spear, modifies it with the Winkler device, and goes after Norman, who has his hands full when he's confronted by Kamala's team, and gives him a good run for the money. It was a fun brawl and a good opportunity to show Goblin at his most psychotic again, with him even going for the kill with Wreck Rap. Wait, Wreck Rap's back as well? And pretty much so he can be stabbed and be of zero use in stopping Norman? As well as trolling us with this guy now? The rest of the team put up a fight, but the Goblin is just too powerful, to the point where he flees into the sewer. Peter, Kamala, and everyone that isn't Wreck Rap follow him down there, but find that Kraven's there, and he's also a villain again. Hear me out, this was so out of left field that I thought there must have been two Kravens again, especially since he didn't have the bloodshot eye earlier in this issue. But it was only a few pages ago that this guy was trying to help Peter with the spear, so the whole thing feels like a nonsensical twist, solely for Peter and Norman to have a solo fight. I'm even more convinced of this because we see nothing of Kraven vs Kamala. She just shows up later having won, and that's that. If Wells was so reluctant to give us a payoff, just have the door to the sewer close after Peter entered it. Seeing anything of that fight would have helped break up the monotony of this final battle between Norman and Peter, which, I shit you not, was like a mystical ping pong game of the Goblin energy just hopping between the two. That's it. The initial fight in issue 50 was far more intense. Sure, it'll never top the final fight of the first Raimi movie, but it was one of the best in Wells' run. So why couldn't we end with something similar? The fight on the front cover was more exciting, even if it's kinda clickbait since the Goblin Spider left the series 3 issues earlier. And I won't claim to be an expert on mystical Goblin energy, but did it just evaporate in the end? I know the living brain had something to do with it, and again Peter has a battle in his mind, which is a stupid trope that I'm sick of seeing now, but I'm certain it just got bored of bouncing between Peter and Norman and evaporated. No one's going to convince me otherwise. Nor will anybody be able to convince me that Wells didn't want the best of both worlds from this ending. With the Goblin energy gone, Norman could go back to being the mild-mannered version of himself, but Wells still gets his big Goblin finale. The only lasting ramification is that I think Peter's annoyed at him, which makes no sense since he was also possessed by it, and knows it's now gone, but who cares? I touched on it earlier, but it's such a cop-out that the evil can just be removed from Norman. It was baffling enough how he could just be cleansed by Sin Eater when Spencer was on Spidey. But now that energy is just in Limbo, but not the Limbo location, I mean proper Limbo. Ready to find Norman when the story needs it, but it can just as easily be removed? Where are the stakes for any future Goblin story? Either make Norman evil or not, it's that simple. I get the hero turned villain, villain gone hero is a long established trope, but it's rarely done this half-hearted. Or does every character in the Marvel Universe have the option to flip-flop morality without a redemption arc? Wasn't that the gimmick of Axis? In that case, sign me up for a run where a Cloud turns Red Skull good and becomes best friends with Captain America. Along with the constant need to turn Peter evil, I can't help but come back to that one question. Who is Spider-Man? The longer this run went on, I became more certain that Wells must have known, because he took everything away from Peter that made him Spider-Man, but never pulled it back to hammer home the true answer. There were a few glimmers of hope here and there, but this run took every opportunity it could to avoid telling a Spider-Man story. It would rather have a vengeful Peter, or have MJ become a hero, or have him as his own background character in his own event, or even here at the end with a Goblin-Spider hybrid. He may know who Spider-Man is, but not who he wants his Spider-Man to be. You see this with long-established characters, where the writer is such a huge fan that they can reference the nichest of moments throughout the history, but that level of fandom often works against them. They become so determined to leave their mark on the character they love, so that they can stand amongst the legends that made them a fan in the first place. But they try so hard to stand out that they ultimately make the character something that they're not. Telling a good Spider-Man story isn't enough, because the character is so popular that there's already good stories that get forgotten about after a few years. They need to do more, turn everything they can on its head. And as we see here with Wells, only give us something that is a poor reflection on the character, and lesser than if they had just aimed for a cliche but good Spider-Man story. That's all my dumbass can surmise from looking at this self-proclaimed climactic end. It should have answered all the questions that I had from the start, but the only one that I have now is why isn't this the end like the book itself claims? I have every belief that this run should have been done by now. I don't know if it was a scheduling thing, part of the plan, or the dreaded editorial interference, but if nothing else, it's a blessing in disguise, as issue 55 may be my favourite that Wells has done. The idea is simple. Peter's finally going on a date with Shay, and even though she'd only appeared during that weird story with MJ's aunt, I wanted this to work for Peter. Sure, the MJ relationship feels far stronger because it's got decades of history behind it, but Peter could possibly learn from the few lessons he's had in this run and find a new beginning. And I like Shay. She's damn fine, quite sweet, and damn fine, even if 90% of her stories are jargon. But that feels like a good balance for Peter. I don't know what the consensus is on her though, so maybe the internet thinks she's Paul 2.0. In many ways it's frustrating because this is evidence that Wells could tell a good Spider-Man story, and he did it with very little Spider-Man. After 3 botched attempts, Peter and Shay meet for dinner, but it's interrupted when Rhino and the annoying side mission from the Insomniac games cause a scene outside. With the burden of Spider-Man weighing heavy, Pete leaves, but instead of donning the webs, he speaks to them, human to human. There was something wholesome here about seeing these two villains agree to take a day off because they know how tough it is in the dating world. It was like the moments we had earlier on before Sandman relapsed, and highlighted what I mentioned in the last part, that writing a good Spider-Man story isn't about reinventing the wheel, but finding that balance between man and hero. There's no way it was enough to turn the whole run around, but it does make me wonder what could have been if things earlier on were different. And maybe if this had been different with the overabundance of anniversary issues, I wouldn't have been as annoyed when there's yet another one here. It's the day of Ned's trial. Peter's running late as he's caught up helping She-Hulk, who also happens to be defending Ned. So how in the fuck did Peter miss the whole trial if he went straight to the court after stopping Bulldozer? Was it because he had to get changed? Because he seemed pretty good at that during the Goblin arc. But he gets there just in time to hear the case is dismissed and still gets scolded by by Ned and Betty. I can't speak for everyone, but I didn't think about this broken friendship in over 40 issues, so who cares? The whole point of this scene is so that Peter can enlist himself as a proxy with She-Hulk, so that a case can be built against Tombstone. Do you want to guess when we get this scene? After the story that chronologically follows this, where Tombstone is arrested and released on bail. So where is the tension? You can try the Tarantino approach if you're telling an interesting story, which, if you couldn't guess, this Ned scene isn't. It's almost as oddly placed as when we see Peter having dinner at Paul and MJ's. They said it might happen a few times, but this wasn't really a loop I needed closing. It was just one last chance to hammer home that Paul is a really great guy, as he gives money to the science team that was affected by Rabin. I can't remember the last time Paul was even in this series, so just have a smaller page count. Where this actually starts is once Tombstone re-emerges after he's been working in the shadows since Gang War, and having had one of his shipments intercepted by Spider-Man, decides to send him a message by going after the only common link that they have, Peter. Honestly, I thought Tombstone had been left at a point that made sense, having reclaimed his throne, but having him attack Peter was interesting, and carried on what I was saying made the Shay story before special. It turns out Peter had set up a plan so that if Tombstone got him, She-Hulk and Luke Cage would intercept, which was easy enough to understand without the Ned scene after this, and it's also how Tombstone gets apprehended so that he can be put on trial. However, with no key witnesses, it looks like he's destined to walk free, until Janice enters the courtroom to testify against her father. And this is what takes us to the finish line, but the whole thing feels a bit late. Janice and Randy have been integral for a large part of this run, but even as she's preparing to go against her father, I don't find her interesting. She's a plot device. Her entire personality is being Tombstone's daughter. I can't see anything that would make her an intimidating villain, nor any warmth, so I can see why Randy would go through these ordeals to be with her. The only concern I did have for Janice was how she could fall multiple floors, land on her neck, and still walk away. She really held this back from being a tense finale, and it was the exact opposite to the problem that the Goblin finale had. There was no emotional connection, but the story played out in a way that was captivating enough. I didn't care if Tombstone killed Janice, but as soon as he broke out, I was interested to see how he'd go about it, especially as he sets out traps using his henchmen to get him across the city despite the manhunt. There's no Goblin Spider gimmick, but it doesn't need one. The chase through the subway did feel poetic since Tombstone was the villain that opened this run, and it's one of those times where I wish this had been in live action, as a large part of this is just Spidey flooring Tombstone as he wait for the train to leave. I don't know, I like to imagine there was a lot of standing there whilst it announced the doors were closing and warning them to stand clear, but despite this being the final battle of Wells' time on Spider-Man, the movement was weird. Part of it has them both on the ground, lying on the side punching, but even Spidey's body wouldn't be able to get in a good punch at that angle. But perhaps that's because a lot of this doesn't seem to think about where Spider-Man fits in. If the previous Goblin arc highlighted how often Wells relied on corrupting Peter, this one demonstrates how often Peter could be an afterthought, which is why this ending feels so absolutely underwhelming. After the two fight until they pass out, Tombstone's brought to trial again, but the case is dismissed as he got to the judge beforehand. No resolution, no development, no lesson. If Tombstone's storyline had ended with Gang War, he would still be in the exact same place. He'd still be in power and can snake his way out of any case, so what did any of this prove? And as I turn the final page, that's how I felt about a lot of Wells' run, made worse by the hasty closing scenes to wrap up loose threads despite attempts at a resolution. The scene with Peter teaming up with MJ didn't make me any happier about her sudden shift into being Jackpot, even if they both acted like it was the most natural dynamic. The double date with them, Paul and Shay, didn't help to bring Peter's new relationship to a place where I felt vindicated in backing these two. The moments between Peter and Aunt May didn't feel earned, because she'd taken such little focus over the course of the series. But Rabbit going back to work with Tombstone, that really needed real estate in this final issue. Even the characters created by this series felt unresolved. Wreck-Rap is just in the regular Marvel world, but with no mission or change from when we first met him. He's basically the Gold Bulls of the Spidey world. Chasm squashed his beef with Peter, which would be a resolution if he didn't immediately admit that he's still waiting for his chance at revenge. And even Paul, the big bad Paul, the bane of every fan's existence since 2022, was just there. I was so convinced he'd become the final villain. With the way he'd been positioned, the connection to Rabin, and the hatred from the community, it seemed like the perfect setup that never delivered. When I started, I asked myself if Wells' time on Spider-Man could be as bad as everyone said. I doubted it because there's a phenomenon that you see all the time on the internet, the blind herd mentality. echo chambers, a fear of not agreeing with the consensus, and one right opinion. You see it all the time, and these generalizations are used to dismiss anything against it. My deep dive into the Nick Spencer run had countless people dismissing my thoughts because it's nowhere near as bad as Wells, but refused to refute the points I was making. How mad is it that Wells' time was apparently so bad it improved the quality of the previous lackluster run? It goes both ways as well, because it's the same with the Immortal Hulk. Dare to say it's not the greatest run of all time because it loses steam after 15 issues, then years later you'll still be told that you're wrong by people who can't even argue against the point, because this is the age where people follow the consensus first and develop their own opinions second. So unfortunately for Wells, this run never stood a chance, because the idea that this was the worst run to ever exist became the rhetoric before people even gave it a chance. It can't escape that label, which turns people away, and as a result makes the whole thing a complete failure. But does it deserve that reputation? Is the collective voice reflective of the final product? And the question we had from the beginning, is it as bad as everyone says? For the most part, yeah, I can't even recommend it as a so bad it's good kind of read, and I wanted this to be a balanced review. I've tried to find the nuggets of gold, to praise it even if I had to go digging myself, but it still wasn't enough. The reliance on an evil Peter as a shock tactic wore thin. Dark Web was a boring mess, and if I never see Wreck-Rap again, I'm gonna take that as a win. It's one of those times where I felt the reputation was right, and even whilst I've been trying to delve into a theme and figure out what it is that Wells wanted to say, it's been a struggle. Even I thought I was talking out my arse with that fatherhood bit, which because the work that was done with Tombstone and Norman was one of the only bits that captured me interest, and the only other theme that I could find with any kind of substance was moving on. Peter had to learn to do it after his relationship with MJ was taken away from him, and went through the stages until he could try again and accept what was. In the same way, the comic community will move on from Wells' run. It may not be for a while, but there will eventually be another series that becomes the most hated. The internet will be in uproar about the next big change, and maybe people will look back on Wells' run with a different perspective. And I'll get told that my thoughts here and now aren't valid and that they've aged like milk, and they'll come from people that probably still haven't read the series.